Hello everyone, and welcome from me, Curtis Hutchinson and Philip Nothard, to this special Motor Trade Radio weekly podcast interview powered by eBay Motors Group. Today, we're delighted to welcome back friend to the podcast, Steve Young, Managing Director of ICDP, the International Automotive Retailing and After Sales Consultancy. Steve's joining us for the latest in our regular chats about some of the trends impacting the car retailing sector, with a special focus this time on Tesla. So welcome back to the podcast, Steve.
Thanks, Curtis, and thanks, Philip. Belated Happy New Year to you and to all your listeners.
To you too. Yes.
So good to be back.
Good, and to you. So I know you got a busy household with all sorts of projects going on. So we may get some interruptions, but I think I've got some deliveries this afternoon. But we'll try and work our way through it. So as always, welcome back and a happy New Year to you as well, Steve, and thanks for coming on so early in the year. This week. We always talk about your blogs, and we do love your blogs, and I know the audiences do as well. And this week you published a blog which the listeners can find on the ICDP website, and outlining your thoughts on Tesla and whether the recent run of negative headlines around missed production targets, falling share values, price cuts would see it crash and burn. So let's start with the global sort of price cuts which Tesla announced last week, and sees the Model 3 falling around 16%, the Model Y performance by about 12% in the UK, with discounts which in the US of up to 20%. What are your view on why Tesla's felt this was necessary, and what impact will it have on the in the UK, do you think?
Well, I think it's a combination of reasons, as there usually is with anything. Nothing's ever that simple. They clearly face a lot more competition than they did, even just 2 years ago. Let's say, when Model Y sort of came along, or a couple of years before that, Model 3. So there's a lot more competition. As I said in the blog, you look at Mercedes; they've got 7 different EQ models, distinct models in the lineup, and it's not only them. It's Audi, it's BMW, it's Hyundai, it's so on. So it's a very, very different landscape to what it was 5 years ago, or when they launched Model S a decade ago, and that has to make a difference. I think there's also a little bit of mischief, probably. Tesla claim that they're getting continual productivity improvements and getting costs down out of the batteries and the other materials that go into the car. And so whilst they're cutting the prices, they probably aren't cutting the margins to the same extent. So it's something that they can do, which possibly their competitors are not in a position to do financially. And then they're volume driven, and Musk has said on many occasions it's about volume, it's about growth, it's about changing the world. It's not about profit in the first instance. And they have opened 3 factories in the last year, a little bit more than a year. Berlin for Europe, Austin in Texas, Shanghai in China. They've expanded the original plant in Fremont in California. So they have a number of extra mouths to feed. And when you take all of that into consideration, then I think there just came the point where they said, okay, this is it. We've got a target for this year. We're possibly not going to meet it as if we leave things as they are. So they cut back the prices and stimulated the demand, which is exactly what every other manufacturer does, just not quite attracting the same headlines.
I was going to say, I mean, it's not new to OEMs and manufacturers, is it, to do price changes in one form or another, and we might touch on that later in terms of the way they've done it. But I mean, they've had a loyal customer base over the years, haven't they? And do you think this will alienate customers to the Tesla brand, or do you think that will maintain? I mean, you touched earlier. There's a lot of alternative offerings now entering the sector, isn't there? So they are up against some stronger competition than would have seen in previous years.
I think that most people are leasing the product, and so the pain is not so much on individuals, but on the leasing companies who've taken the car onto the books at value X, and now it's X minus 16%. But as we also again know from traditional manufacturers, that if you discount at the front end, then you also knock the residual at the back end, and the actual holding cost, the depreciation over the 3 years or whatever, will not move by 16% or whatever. So the holding costs probably will be something similar. And if you were going along to lease a car now at the reduced list price, that they're behind that, there will also be an assumption about a lower residual. If the holding cost is the same, forget the influence of interest rates, then probably the lease rates aren't going to change very much. So there's a lot of noise, a lot of negative posts on Twitter or other social media sites. The reality, I think, that people will just look at the car, and net probably more people will be attracted to look at it than by the headline of lower prices than will be put off buying them. Be my view.
And Steve, this was very much a global announcement, and it will see some Tesla models benefit from favourable government tax breaks, certainly in some European markets, notably France, and also the US as well. So do you think if the cuts actually stimulate greater demand, can the higher volumes actually compensate for what will be smaller margins? And you did mention in passing there that Tesla are very much in control of their margins. So how do you think that will be affected by these prices coming down?
I don't know the economics of Tesla specifically, but the whole reason why you get end of month push from a traditional manufacturer, end of quarter, whatever, is because the contribution from each additional unit is relatively large. And for Tesla, with the additional control they have over their value chain, batteries, for example, then I'm sure that incremental profit is even higher. So if they can add another 5%, 10% to the volume, then they're getting a good contribution of that. I'm certain of it, and that's what's driving it. And with the investments that have been made in the new facilities, then they want to run those at as high capacity utilization as they can. It doesn't make any sense to have a facility that's 2 years old that they're actually taking layoff days or cutting back the production rate. So yeah, there'll be economic benefit for them for sure.
Yeah, and just by way of a follow-up, I mean these discounts that price cuts that we've mentioned, they equate to something like £5,500 for the Model 3 and around 7,000 for the Model Y. So these are considerable price cuts, which I guess effectively will take Tesla out of that premium EV sector into more of a sort of volume-driven market. And does that matter, do you think?
Um, I certainly don't think it matters to Elon Musk. As I said, his he declares sort of higher ambitions in the sense of, he's not trying to build the biggest car company. He's trying to make the biggest change to the planet. So he's not going to make the biggest change to the planet by focusing on 100,000 plus supercars. He's going to do it by hitting volume. And so I think from that point of view, he'd be probably quite happy. And the cars, if you're honest about them, are not really premium. In the if you actually look at the quality of the build or the fit and finish and so on, it's a nice car. It's a decent car, but my Model S had the build quality of perhaps a Ford, but it was priced against a Mercedes.
Yeah.
And that, given that the competition is now coming along, and so you get all the nicer materials, more even panel gaps and all these things, then one way to get away from that comparison is by reducing the prices and basically repositioning the cars a little bit below. It's been premium because they have been relatively rare, and people have subscribed to the values that the car represents in terms of being, at least by some measures, a green choice, an environmentally friendly choice.
And I mean, before we move on, thinking about competitors in the market space and sort of staying with new vehicle pricing, I mean, how much of this will be on the back of the US Biden EV incentive that they've done over there? And it had to reduce the prices to get that tax credit in the US, because there's a tax credit available, and he was above that, wasn't he? I think for some of his
But
vehicles.
yeah, but my understanding, it was also just the fact that the credit wasn't payable or wasn't claimable until January the 1st. And so basically sales had stalled because unless he got the effectively cushioned the customer from the fact they weren't able to claim the rebate if they had the car delivered in December, then they weren't going to sell the cars. And that for him is important. He sets these massively ambitious growth targets, and then it would have been a big fail, even if it was in reality by a matter of a few weeks or even a few days, if the cars were not shipped until January as opposed to December. I think there's a number of places. You mentioned France. We've got the same in the UK. Where there are price thresholds above which credits are either not paid or paid at a lower rate. So yeah, you get some advantage of that, but we all know that's a moving feast. It keeps on changing, not just in the UK but everywhere else. So you get some temporary advantage or disadvantage, and then the next government comes along or the next budget comes along and the thresholds are changed. So I think that's more of a temporary effect.
And it's interesting you talk about growth and ambitious targets. I mean, he's obviously gone that he failed the target, but still, I think was it 1.4 or 1.4 million was the target, and they finished on 1.37 million, which is
Yeah.
and you point out in your blog that it's a 50% annual organic growth, which is no mean feat for any business, is it? Let's not, in context of what is achieved, to fail at 1.37 against a target of 1.4, it's not a bad miss, is it?
No, I mean, particularly at those sorts of volumes. I've managed a business in the past that got 50% growth, but we were starting off at sort of 10,000 units or 9,000 units. So that's a very, very different ball game to already being basically at 1,000,000 units and then getting 50%. So I think you've got to sort of say, look, give the guy a break. I mean, I'm not an Elon Musk fan as such, but I mean that is just an incredible performance, and it's not a 1 year. I mean, this is year after year after year now since, I don't know, 2017 or whenever it was that he got out of his so-called production hell. That he's managed that sort of growth and done it, with new plants, which is another level of challenge. Not in a new plant. It's not a new plant in Hungary compared to Germany. It's a new plant on the other side of the world. The first plant in China, the first plant in Europe. Texas, many Americans would argue, is a completely different country to California. It's certainly a
Yes.
good distance away. You can't bus people over there to help for a day or two. Yeah. So you've got to give them credit for that.
And I mean, you talk about the low prices, and we're talking about these thresholds. And you mentioned it before about the price points being more on the leasing sector and company cars, and the benefit in kind and things like this around that whole EV world. But do you think there's do you think there's a move for being more competitive in the private space? And do you think it will be for a price war, obviously trying to get in with the new entrants that you mentioned earlier, with Mercedes and other new operators, and notwithstanding the Chinese operators that are now thinking of entering Europe and the UK?
Well, I think even with the price cuts, Tesla is still not a cheap car. They're not pitching against MG, and I think that whole question about affordability that Carlos Tavares has also raised, that we're turning the car into a product which is not available to every man, every person, every a reasonable aspirational goal. That if you're doing okay, whatever it is that your job is, then you can afford to buy a new car. And Tavares is flagging that up quite rightly. And Tesla's not in the space that's changing that. They're still expensive cars, as almost all EVs are. And for the Chinese brands, then some of them are coming into the sort of the same space as MG. Some are positioned a bit a bit higher up in the same space as Tesla, Mercedes, and so on. It doesn't move the needle in terms of affordability, I don't think. For a societal level, as opposed to an individual who says, okay, $7,000 off, I can. If that translates into a corresponding reduction in lease rate, which, as I said earlier, is not a given, then yeah, I'll go for it.
Now, these price cuts actually follow some pretty heavy month-on-month residual value falls for Tesla in the used car market, with CAP HPI reporting the 3-year-old examples of the Model S fell 9.6% in December, so that's around £3,000, and 1-year-old Model Ys were down 6%, which is £3,100. And this trend has actually been seen, and CAP HPI have pointed this out. It's been seen across other EV brands, so it's not specific to Tesla. But do you think EVs are starting to find their right use value now, and will these price cuts at the front end actually help that?
I don't know what the right value is. I do think that given that this is a used car is in general being sold to a private buyer, then they are more susceptible, more influenced by all the negative news about the increasing cost of running an electric car, and perhaps to some extent about the availability of a functioning charging network and so on as well. But that's more qualitative. But at the quantitative side, increasing cost of ownership, which undoubtedly there is because of energy prices and the changes in taxation and so on, mean that it's no longer the the cheap to operate option that it was 4 years ago, 3 years ago. So demand, I'm sure, will decline. In the meantime, we all know that the petrol cars have become more and more efficient with every year. So when you've got headlines from RAC or AA or others saying that we're reaching operating cost parity, then we shouldn't be surprised to see the EVs losing their premium.
I guess the point I was trying to make was, with those Tesla models specifically coming down so much, will this be the jump start that was actually needed to grow used car sales within EVs in the used car market?
Well, I still think that the questions around operating costs will have will have perhaps a stronger influence. But if they become more affordable, and obviously there's much higher volume, then that will help. I think some lenders are still nervous lending on a used EV, not so much a 1-year-old or 3-year-old, but by the time you get into 4 or 5-year-old and you begin to sort of get question marks about the expiry of the battery warranty and how the car has been used or abused and so on, then that still remains a risk, and that will be that is picked up by the lenders, and it would certainly be one of the things that would be front of my mind. But I'm perhaps more technically informed than the average buyer. But I think there's still some pain to come as the technology develops and as we start to see potentially quite wide variations between and hidden variations between two EVs of the same model of the same year, but one spent its life on high-speed chargers and the other's always been charged overnight at home. So
Yeah.
I think it will still remain quite a volatile used car market for some years to come.
Yeah, I think you're right there. I think it is just finding the position in the market, aren't they? We've never had a volume of used EVs entering the sector, like we're starting to see now, and it'll just they'll find a place. As unfortunately, we're old enough to know that over time these things they find the place in the market, don't they? The price point and position they sit within the market against the peers and everything else. So it's going to be interesting to watch. But like you say, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take years for that to wash its way through.
You saw a little bit of it with Dieselgate, where initially the diesel values and level of interest in diesels fell, and the um, used car dealers were sat on higher stocks of diesels because everyone thought, oh, this is the work of the devil. Pretty quickly, people thought, but on the other hand, I get an extra 20-30% fuel efficiency, and I like how they drive. So we got back to some normality, and there was no. I did a lot of analysis on residual values on diesel versus petrol post Dieselgate, and there was nothing there. In the end, there was nothing there. Just a short-term blip.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, thinking about the bigger picture, and you touched on it a little bit earlier, and thinking about Tesla, and Tesla's shares have fallen by 2/3 over the last year, there and thereabouts. And for most companies, that would be potentially quite terminal for them. But you make the point in the blog that this is just as how robust the business is. And I mean, why do you think that? I mean, there's still, even though shares of volume, the values of the shares have dropped 2/3. I mean, it's still pretty well valued, isn't it?
Well, it is. I mean, the most remarkable thing is after the fall of 2/3 over the last year, then it's still valued at, 4 times the value of Porsche, or twice the value of Toyota. So that is objectively totally ludicrous. But it is where it's how investors look at it. I think there's probably a cohort of investors who have been in there for a long time. They bought their shares at significantly lower values, and they've probably taken some profits at some point. They're still quite happy. They still believe in Musk and his potential to change things, and so they stay in there, and it still gives it that what objectively is an inflated value. But the fact it has that inflated value, and the fact that it's growing volumes and is reasonably consistently profitable, tells you that it's not going anywhere. No one's going to come along, open their wallet, and pay twice the value of Toyota in order to buy out. It's not going to collapse.
No, I think it's all right, isn't it? We don't need to lose sleep over it, do we, Steve?
No. I'm not. Whatever Elon Musk may be pacing the floor at at night and thinking about and worrying about. I'm absolutely certain it's not Tesla.
Now, finally, Steve, in your blog, you make an interesting observation that with Tesla's production cuts, shortfalls in sales forecasts, and the resulting price cuts, they're all pretty much the business model reality of a OEM running a direct sales channel. And you make an interesting parallel here with agencies. So, are there any lessons to be learnt from what Tesla is doing at the moment by some of those OEMs who are embracing agency?
Uh, I'll say, unfortunately, I think there is, because I think that a lot of the manufacturers who are rushing towards agency have not really thought through how they're going to manage the pricing. I think
Yeah,
they've looked at Tesla and thought, oh, it's dead easy. You know, what you do is you set a price and you might come along and tweak it every few months. But the price will be the price. And, that may be overstating it slightly. But if you contrast it with what I think is actually required to make agency work well, which is much more like airlines, seats or hotel rooms, where you've true dynamic pricing that's changing according to what somebody's looking for at a particular point in time, and how your order fill is working, how your production week is filling up, but also, if you like, how your airline seats are filling up or your hotel rooms are filling up. That's the analogy. It's not put it out there at a fixed price and then somehow, between you and your agents, you're going to sell the 1,200 cars, that are coming off the production line, every you know week or day or whatever. It's not like that, and so hopefully the manufacturers who are, you know, walking towards agency have seen how a badly handled price adjustment, can reflect on you in the headlines, and will think more carefully about how they're going to monitor pricing, monitor demand, make the adjustments, how frequently they have to make the adjustments, and how the adjustment is made. So, make the adjustment through the finance offer, make the adjustment through, um, some non-cash promotion, but absolutely do not come along and say, hey, it's the end of the month or the end of the quarter, and we're going to give you 5,000 off this month. Because as soon as you go down that route, then everybody will understand that that's the game to play, and um, they will then wait till the end of the month. And you saw a little bit of that with Tesla. I did see some numbers about the proportion, the percentage of Tesla's 1.37 million that was sold in December, or the last 2 weeks of December, and it was huge. And if you end up in that situation, then you're dead, because you will not get the economics. You need to have demand that matches production, and to get demand that matches production, you need to make incremental, granular changes in the offer to the customer, not come along and do some headline grabbing. It's 7.5% off, or $7,500 or whatever.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Steve. So, yeah, if they do feel the need to discount, it will be behind the scenes. It will be in whatever packages and promotions they're offering customers, to avoid those, as you say, those headline grabbing figures that we've seen over the last week or so
I'm
around
not
Tesla.
saying, yeah, I'm not saying it will be. I'm saying it should be. I think,
Oh, right.
we
Yeah.
you know we we,
Oh,
we, we, we we all know the behavior of some
yeah.
brands, including some brands who are going through agency, and I don't have that confidence that
Yeah.
you're not going to end up with a business running on agency which still ends up throwing a whole load of cars out into daily rental, or into, through broker channels, or even worse, self registrations by dealers, which they can do. There's nothing to stop a dealer having, 0 mile, delivery mile cars on their balance sheet to sell under agency, but you know how many new cars they're going to sell under the agency contract in those circumstances. Big fat
Yes.
zero.
Yeah. And also, I must ask you this, Steve. In your blog, you hint that Tesla might at some stage appoint agents. When and why do you think that will happen?
Well, I think the facilities, the sorts of facilities they've been opening up, not just in the UK but elsewhere in Europe and the States, in the last 2-3 years have been much more modest. They've typically been former dealer sites that they take on the lease or they buy, and then they give it a quick lick of grey paint, put the totem up, and hey presto, it's a Tesla site. And so the investment that's sitting behind that is much less than the investment that's involved in the sort of mall outlets that they had in the early days in Westfield or wherever. So the capital that's tied up in these sites is much less per site, but there are also many more of them. And I think one of the reasons why manufacturers tend not to be very good at running retail is because the complexity multiplies. And so if you've got a couple of sites, then you can manage that relatively easily. If you've got 20 sites, it's becoming more difficult. If you've got 40, 50, 120, then it becomes more complex still. And I don't think Tesla will ever end up with 120 sites in the UK like a traditional network. But I think it's absolutely believable they would end up with 30 or 40. And at that point, you say, you know what, it's worth giving somebody 5% or 6% to take that operating responsibility away from us.
And it feels that with what we were talking earlier with the used vehicle side of Tesla, you put that kind of volume out into the new vehicle market, you start to see the volume coming back into the used vehicle marketplace. Initially there's still a lot that sit within that leasing sector in terms of that, going out for second and third leases before it comes into the used vehicle park. But the more they do in the private sector, the more they'll enter that used vehicle park. And that needs managing, doesn't it? And the network or agents would potentially help the remarketing of used Teslas, where other manufacturers have probably, got a lot more experience at being able to do that.
No, absolutely. I think in the early days they tried to keep it as a closed system, that the cars came back to them, and it'd be quite difficult to find a Tesla that was running free, if you like, through the normal auctions or independent used car traders and so on. Now, obviously, that's gone, and but the volumes are going up just the same as they are on the new side, but with a 3-year lag. So, if the volumes have gone up by 50% year on year on new, then come 2026, they'll be going up 50% on used, and they need to find a home.
Yeah.
And if they don't, obviously it affects their ability to make a competitive offer on the new car.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think there's a lot to play out with that. I mean, again, we were going to talk about other things on today's interview and catch up, but obviously the Tesla story and your blog could not be missed to talk through some of that. And if anybody's not seen it either through Steve's social channels or head over to the ICDP website, which is icdp.net, and you can find it there. You won't be disappointed. The opening paragraph kind of says it all about Tesla's Roadster, which Elon Musk fired into space back in 2018, will at some point come back through the atmosphere and crash and burn. Now, I mean, that's not within our lifetime, is it, Steve?
No, I think not only not in your lifetime or my lifetime, maybe not in mankind's lifetime, to be perfectly honest. But that's inevitable. I think what happens with Tesla Motors is a different ballgame altogether.
Yes, but a fascinating view on Tesla, and like you say, it grabbed a lot of sensational headlines over the last sort of 72 hours and more. But I think it all needed some context in the conversation. So again, thank you for coming on today, Steve, and sharing your thoughts. And like I say, listeners, do head over to the ICDP website and check out the blog. And if you haven't done already, then please, subscribe to the blogs that Steve does provide, and they'll come into your email. And obviously everything else is there that you can check out at ICDP and what they do offer and available to you as a customer or a member of the ICDP. And thanks for coming on again.
That's a pleasure, Philip. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks, Curtis. It's always fun to chat.
Yeah, no, always great to catch up with you, Steve, and do come back again soon. But unfortunately, that's all for now. So many thanks for joining us for this special weekday Motor Trade Radio podcast sponsored by eBay Motors Group. We'll be having more interviews with industry bosses and analysts over the coming weeks. Thanks once again to Steve for joining us today. We're back again with the headlines next weekend. Until then, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.